Hello everyone, today we talk about the Ottoman Qapu Khalqi. The Qapu Khalqi literally meaning gate people or court people, depending on which way you want to translate the term. That is ambivalent in this sense, and also known as Qapu Khalqi, that is instead here referring specifically to the slaves, gate or court slaves, was in origin the Ottoman Sultan's own army of dependent household slaves. And these were originally manned by prisoners and mercenaries, Muslim and non-Muslim alike. Right, and its alternative name Qapu Khalqi gave rise to the Latin word capitulare, which therefore often occurs in Western sources. And the etymology being the capu proper, that is the element remaining in both names that was the one that gave the origin to the same word port, gate, right? So that came to define eventually, it was soon applied to the central Ottoman government and therefore Constantinople, right? And the Sultan's standing army alike. And this was originated since Byzantine times, right? So this denomination is actually very, very ancient. Is found also in Western European chronicles, in fact. Now, an important aspect we have to stress, and here I think you've read it from the title, but today we're essentially discussing the Qapu Khalqi in the, let's say, in the 14th and the 15th century. So this court had an evolution, right? And originally, however, this is very important, it did not include the Janisseries, right? Eventually it would, actually. The Qapu Khalqi was known as also including the Janisseries, but at this point is mentioned as separated from them, right? And what is interesting, in fact, is that the Sultan's slaves were named as Qapu Khalqi, in fact, and recorded as such, fighting in some of the most important battles of the time, such as the one of Ankara against the Timurids in 1402, and the one of Varna against the Crusaders in 1444. And even Ducas, that is the Byzantine source, records the presence of the port at the Battle of Nicopolis against the Crusaders in 1396, for which he probably intended the Qapu Khalqi, or perhaps the Qapu Khalqi plus the Janisseries, right, as two separated things at this time. As even actually to the same Ducas, the distinction was not clear at that point. And Ducas describes the Qapu Khalqi as the Turks called Porta. That is, the palace guards were redeemed slaves from the diverse Christian nations and numbered more than 10,000. We will see later that this number is probably inflated, but it's important that the composition of these units that was conceived as essentially composed of these redeemed Christian slaves, right? And that it's the Ottoman army had an enormous amount of Christian fighters, either actually slaves or freemen, as a matter of fact. We will see it better later, because within the same Qapu Khalqi there were different segmentations. Like the Christians weren't just all slaves; they were also, fundamentally princes, heirs of vassals, etc. But we will see later now. So, what was the Qapu Khalqi composed like? So, well, initially there were apparently 6 of these companies, the first of which were established from the personal salaried horsemen of Kara Timurtash, that was Belir Bey of Rumelia, an important figure also in the Ottoman expansion in Europe between the 14th and 15th century. And this happened around 1376. And these units were known as the, I don't know how it's pronounced in Turkish actually, but I think it's Ulufecyian, which means salaried men, or mercenaries if you prefer, but historically speaking there is not much of a difference. We got obsessed by this name mercenary just from the 19th century onwards. We call them soldiers. That's what etymologically speaking that means. And however, it's probably important to stress that originally speaking the composition of these units, and probably also afterwards, was more varied than what we think. When we think especially of slaves, we think as if these were just guys whipped all the time by this terrible master. It wasn't quite like slavery, was more like a feudal bond, right? Of course, juridically, tying in this sense, because you weren't free to do what you wanted, but still these guys were considered elite, and they would make a career accordingly, as it would happen, as we know, for the Janisseries over time. And this unit of Ulufecyian were divided into a left and right unit, respectively known as Ulufecyian-i-Yesar and Ulufecyian-i-Yemin. And this distinction indicated the position on the battlefield in relation to the sultan, right, and constituting two companies that were in fact deployed respectively left and right. Next to these two units, established soon afterwards, there was another one called the Gureba, right, which was similarly comprised of a left and right unit, Gureba-i-Yesar, Gureba-i-Yemin, but this time made up of actual Muslim mercenaries from further afield. And we're talking actually a very diverse ethnic background. That could be either Arabs or Persians or Kurds, and seemingly occasionally Tartars, that this time, as you know, were still around, and would be in fact progressively incorporated even within the Ottoman Empire proper. And that's what Gureba actually means, because it stands for strangers or foreigners. So the two units of the Ulufecyian and the two units of the Gureba comprised altogether the so-called Bolukat-i-Erbah, meaning the four boluks, or four companies. So they were fundamentally a hierarchically framed within this unique corps. And there were the final two companies, the Sili-Dars and the Sipahi-oghlan, which respectively mean the weapon bearers and the Sipahi children. Right. These were established probably in Mehmed's the First reign, and they thereafter became essentially the elite of the corps. Right. These two units drew up on the immediate right of the Sultan in battle, right? And along with some of the Ulufecyian were recruited from among the Janisseries and household slaves that were recruited both from the Qapu-Oghlan, the so-called foreign youths, raised by the Devshirme system that is quite famous, as you know. And so they were picked literally from Christian communities and around the Balkans usually, and eventually trained as Muslim slaves of the Sultan That was essentially their adoptive father, and to whom they were fanatically loyal. And these were the picked troops, let's say, of the Ottoman, the true standing army. That is what effectively began to differentiate the Ottoman army from other systems of the region of the Anatolian peninsula that was originally comprised just by these bands of unprofessional and also non-permanent mortiers, etc. And this instead representing a standing army, a real standing army of a solid power, was structuring its power at this point. Its territorial control, it's and had the resources, the surplus to field them, to maintain them wholes, and to train them, because that at the end of the day makes the difference on the field, right? So the Sipahi-oghlan, so the Sipahi children, as we have defined them, appear to have been drawn specifically from among slaves who were the children of noble families. So actually, between them and the Salaried, these were actually the most elite of all. And each of the Qapu Khalqi companies of household cavalry was commanded by an aga, this is officer, and in the 16th century at least they were organized in squadrons of 20 men. Right? The Ordo Parte, that is this essentially Byzantine description of the court and of the army of the Sultan Mehmed II, right? So we are in the later on, second half of the 15th century, tells us that the Sipahi-oghlan, Sipahi children, were paid, in fact, as the ultra-elite, between 20 and 25 aspers per day. The Salaried 10 to 20, right? So the Gureba from 6 to 10. These were instead, as we've seen, the foreign mercenaries. The Ulufecyian 5 to 6. So here the segmentation and the hierarchy, hierarchization, let's say, is obvious, right? And there were this base of salaried men were fundamentally just troops that were originally levied actually with private sources from local governors there. The foreign mercenaries that were, in this sense, probably kind of more consistent troops, the Salaried that had this honor of weapon bearers, and eventually the Sipahi children that were the sons of the Christian elite that participated to the Devshirme, right? Through various relations that, of course, are that depend on that point, especially at these higher levels, but also diplomatic base, like on political relations between the Balkanic elites and the Ottoman Empire. An early reference to the strength of the Ulufecyian and Gureba is found in the chronicle of Johann Schildberger, that was an eyewitness of the Ottoman-sided Battle of Ankara, right? And who describes how, at the end of the clash, the Sultan stood with a single body of 1,000 cavalry, right? That quite likely correspond to the 4 bullocks, since they were, right next to the Sultan and representing the sort of bodyguard fundamentally. So, 1,000 men, right? Now we will give a list of numbers fundamentally from which you understand, aside from the reliability of the relative sources, that what really varied here was the real organic of these units. Like, these were conceived naturally as permanent bodies, but the way they were recruited differed, right? Because it didn't just entail maintaining men under your control, like, I don't know, like specifically the Janisseries were. These units were much more mixed, if you want. They were also partly made of freemen, right? So actually, similar things are to be witnessed among the Janisseries too at one point. So these were armies that maintained in peacetime surely a certain nucleus, and then in wartime would be filled and strengthened. But also at that point the number would vary. While there is a 16th century source, for example, that says that the four bullocks originally numbered 2,400 men, right? Although this can be maybe a mistake for all the 6 companies, right? The other part, for example, records that the strength of the 6 companies in the late, let's say, in Mehmed II reign, as 700 Ulufecyian, 400 Gureba, 600 salaried, and 600 Sipahi-oghlan, which is a total of 2,300, right? Bertrand de la Brocquière refers of Ottoman household troops that probably excluded the Janisseries, comprising 5,000 salaried cavalry and infantry in all. So here, even of course, this was an army within the army. This is what is important to bear in mind. That this was like the permanent standing army of the Sultan. Right? So it didn't comprise just picked bodies of cavalrymen as a regular bodyguard. It was actually an army in itself. So it of course comprised chiefly cavalry. That seems to have been the most the bulk, the core of the army. But as we'll see better also now, there were many other elements in this army, and of course infantry that at this time was naturally rising in importance even in the Ottoman Empire. And this source, this French source, actually mentions in another passage that Sultan Murad II had 2,000 or 3,000 slaves of his own, among them being many Christians, and this is also with a certain degree of certainty a reference to the household cavalry, right? So this source stresses again that among these troops were many Christians proper. This is important because these were actual Christians. Like there were, as we will see now, there were elements of Christian nobility that came from, they were vassals to the Ottomans that remained Christians. So in this sense, they weren't just like Christian hostages taken to convert to Islam. There were literally Christians there that would remain Christian, would even go back where they were from to become maybe the next ruling class. So this is typical of all the great empires, of taking, of actually educating and training the elites of fundamentally client states, and to give them an idea of what of whom they are dealing with, right? So that I think also about the know-how, the military capacities, and the shared knowledge of military matters that is entailed, right? But we will have a way to see this on other occasions better. Janus Lascaris, later in the 15th century, records that there were at the port 3,000 knights who called themselves slaves, actual words, and were, quote again, limited to a maximum strength of 5,000. So this highlights what we were saying before, that essentially there is a core, in this case of 3,000, that has even a limited amount of expansion, right? It sticks to 5,000. And this probably was due to actual to many reasons, possibly political ones. That this unit has was composed, as we have seen, by several elements at high levels of Ottoman society and in international relations, but also an actual manability, like a unit of between 3,000 5,000 is already quite big, telling the truth. So you want it to be efficient in a functional way, right? Having more than 5,000 heavy cavalry is actually pretty imposing. Also, not just logistically speaking, but in terms of how you control them on the field. So you don't want to. Naturally, there were lots of people who want to join this unit, but you still want it to be maneuverable and to be effective on the field. And having larger numbers very often means not to be more efficient, actually creating exponentially more problems, right? There is another source, that is Arnold von Arf, who visited Constantinople in 1499 and gives the following numbers: 600 for the Silidars that are identified as mostly renegade Christians, and 700 for the Sipahi-oghlan, who were instead the Sultan's bodyguard, right? And this basically, the source confirms essentially the Ordo Porte, adding that there were also other between 700 and 800 trainee Silidars. They were presumably the Adiami-oghlan recruits. So this is very, very important because, as we have seen, it actually reflects the other indications that we have. The Silidars were these weapon bearers that have more that are indicated as renegade Christians specifically, so not just specifically Christian recruits similarly to the Devshirme, but actually renegades. And this is consistent because, you know, when the Ottomans conquered, like they invaded the Balkans, it was actually also in Anatolia. There were plenty of Christians, but the Balkans as well. It was a large frontier areas, so there was naturally, and it was Christian, so there were naturally lots of people who, you know, so fit to serve the Ottomans rather than other powers, right? And this would go on for throughout all Ottoman history. Famously speaking, lots of advisors of the Ottoman Empire actually came from Europe. And what is interesting, though, instead, is that the Sipahi-oghlan, that in this sense were literally the Sultan bodyguards, were composed by these Sipahi children, right? And being the foreign youths. So the closest bodyguard of the Ottoman Sultan at this point were actual Christians, right? And especially Christians who made all a training in order to become Sipahi-oghlan, right? So troops that were essentially serving this major regional power that their homeland was essentially threatened by, but that, you know, they saw as a huge opportunity to actually interplay in it, so to have a political influence also within it, and to even undergo training in order to join the highest, the ultra-elite Ottoman unit that was the same Sultan's bodyguard. So it was an enormous honor, as naturally, right? But it's very meaningful that, as it happens very, very, very often in history, and especially in this broader Christian-Muslim conflict, we can simplify it in that way, is actually that the most favored bodyguards actually were very often from the other religion, right? So that you could, at that point, kind of trust them, right? Obviously, these are, this is not a widespread pattern, right? There was still something fundamentally singular, but historically speaking, we know it. It was dramatically often, and actually, it was much more frequent to see Christians as serving as Muslim leaders' bodyguards than the other way around, right? For different reasons. Now we don't have the time to explain, but this is perhaps one of the best examples, like the Ottoman Empire being basically the major power out there, in Europe proper, because that's what it is, having bodyguards from theoretically what should be the enemy religion, or at least the one you're struggling against, broadly speaking, in this strategic theater. So very important. There is another source, yet another source, that is Calco-Conidiles, that mentions, on the other hand, a unit of only 200 bodyguards that, in this sense, are either the Sipahi-oghlan or an element of them, and 300 others, later 500, who are probably the Salaried. Murad Dawson cites figures of the latter two companies under Mehmed II that are excessively high, even considering the amount of personal attendance that these individual guards actually had on their own, right? These were mostly cavalrymen, as we have seen, and you know that at this point, historically, the prevalent mode, especially of course, as in this case, heavy cavalry, was being the center of a small tactical unit that comprehended other field aids, attendants, and other supporting fighters, and that had been esteemed as from 5 to 6 for the Sipahi-oghlan, for a single one, for a single cavalryman, 4 or 5 for the Salaried, and 2 or 3 for the Ulufecyian, right? This is important because it makes you understand maybe why even the source, the Janus Laskaris that we have read before, was pointing out that this unit, this corps, had to have a maximum strength of 5,000, because at that point, if you multiply it for all the various attendants you have to use, you easily get to an enormous amount of men that are terribly complicated to maneuver on the field, like to even move strategically, telling the truth. And you don't want that, especially if this is the elite, and it has always to be fielded next to the sultan, right? So of course probably there were lesser numbers, probably these units were split, who knows how the thing actually worked, but still the numbers are important. They're not just ciphers. There is an enormous amount of strength, of energies spent in the process. And when you read, this is always what I tell in absolute terms, that when you read something that is superior to 50,000 on a single battlefield, just be skeptical about it in these contexts, because it simply did not exist. They didn't have the actual capabilities of doing it, and even if they had it, it was impossible to control these guys, and it would have been useless, right? You need order, you need an efficient supplying system, you need something that works effectively, and maneuvering an army on the field that is already of, I don't know, in this case of 5,000 cavalrymen, is an immense logistical effort. That here it doesn't matter whether it's the Ottoman Empire or whatever, the problems are equal for every single army in the world, right, at this point. So, what is interesting though is that next to the 6 Qapu Khalqi companies, there were other units, right? There were smaller, but that in this sense were more even tactically functional to the specific purpose that they had. One was the Mutaferrika, that was essentially the actual Sultan's personal guard, right? So the guys who literally stayed, among which he himself stayed at this point. And the name Mutaferrika is actually meaning separated, and this means actually that because this unit was composed chiefly by the sons of vassal princes who were effectively held as hostages and not as slaves. So they were conceptually not seen as how what the Qapu Khalqi was in general. They were this kind of theoretically slave, servile army, but something different. Like, if not peers, of course, in the Ottoman vision, that was the one of an ecumenic power, but still, however, individuals who came from powers with which the Ottomans were dealing at an international table with a bit more of regard, right? And that therefore couldn't be considered slaves of the Sultan as such. And these units were even like, we can think the ultra elite in this sense, more than the actual Sipahi-oghlan itself. And these guys actually received, whilst in Sultan's service, an intensive military training, right? So these were the best that, the Ottoman Empire was kind of bullying around these various vassals with threat of annihilation, and these guys in turn participated to Ottoman affairs in this sense. As we were saying before, they were even, paid their military training, which was a, fine way to even, spread awareness of the same greatness of the empire. This is very important psychologically speaking, because one day you could find these guys as the next generation of your vassal leaders, and that theoretically of your own enemies at some point. So, of course, at this point, it's not much of a, you don't have to hide super weapons know-how. The military capabilities of this power are relative to the actual political and social structures of the country, right? So even if you train them as Ottomans, they don't become superheroes, because that they essentially received the best training that they could have received actually even at their same home. But at this point, with something additional, that is, observing how such an enormous army like the Ottoman one worked, right, and therefore learning much, especially in terms of strategy, not just of tactics, but having this broader understanding of how such an enormous military machine, and the most feared in Europe at the time, actually worked. These hostages performed military service only whilst on campaign, another very important thing, and they were fairly few. So basically they joined, as far as I understand it, the empire in this fort just where there was an actual war going on, and there were a few, like maybe up to 100 during these 2 centuries, and especially the latter actually during 15th, where the Ottoman Empire gains more than it's a regional dimension, let's say. There was also another unit, actually 2, that were essentially special infantry guards, called respectively the Solak and the Peik, which means respectively in turn left-handed and messengers. Both of these units were recruited amongst the Janisseries, and it's very important that they're infantry units, by the way, because the Janisseries represent ideally the Ottoman, the Turkish, let's say, warfare adaptation to more kind of Western way of fighting that, notoriously the Ottomans never had the same amount and consistency of heavy infantry, for example, the Westerners had. So actually the Janisseries were the block of that infantry that represented a valid opponent to the Westerners, but also presenting a lot of trouble to the Eastern cavalries that, the Ottoman Empire, and we made actually, I created a playlist on Ottoman history, which I explained this thing in perspective, like observing how objectively the Ottoman Empire was a radically Western, or however westernized power, wherever you want to call it, because it actually been born in the hub of the Byzantine Empire, in highly westernized lands by all standards, by all means, and the Ottomans had a terrific mindset that was extremely different from the one of the other Muslims, whether they were Arabs or Persian or or Tartars even. Um, and they were much closer to Western military standards. So actually, when you compare the Ottoman military in terms of pike and shot tactics in Western scenarios, you see that basically the Ottomans had everything strong, artillery, light troops, etc., except at least an equivalent, an actual equivalent to the heavy infantry of the Western style. But when you went on the eastern frontier, see the Battle of Calderan, for example, the rise of the Safavids, etc., you see there that the Ottomans were fighting with kind of westernized tactics that the Persians didn't have, and they had also to, to fall back on something different at that point, tactically speaking, because the 16th century's moment of crisis of horse archery dramatically, as also the Russian conquest of Siberia represent, but also in this sense with the Ottoman Empire, it was truly a European power by this point, and had absorbed so much, so immensely much, and this the Qapu Khalqi here show it brilliantly, because there were all lots of Christians in here. There were actually seeing people fought also from the other side, so this is quite meaningful in my opinion. So the Janisseries here as infantry of the Solak, the left-handed, and the Paik, the messengers, right? This unit was part also of the Tsemat, right? And both of these units were commanded by Bashis. Now, the Solak marched on the Sultan's left and right, and their name left-handed actually derives from the fact that they that those who were on the Sultan's left were actually left-handed soldiers, right? This is important. You wonder, what's the role of left-handed, but throughout all on the battlefield, throughout all most history, actually, left-handed were within all the other right-handed in the other units. But it's obvious that in this level of elite and finesse of these troops, you want something that is highly functional, even for a left flank. That is an important thing, because if you have to fight, if anything, with a shield. So the shield, it's either left or right. It doesn't make sense to have it from both sides. You need actually someone on the left flank, for example, that is ready to react in the same way against the threats coming from that direction as a right-handed would do. And this is mostly for actually for missile. Well, not only actually. It's not exaggerate, but that renders the idea. It's a specular formation in its arrangement. And Arnold von Harf, that we have quoted before, refers to these units when he spoke of, quote, foot soldiers like archers in France, who always follow him or run after him, the Sultan, and in towns, and they keep order on the left hand. So this is interesting because they... Okay, yes, excuse me, I was reading something else. So, there are also those archers that the La Baroquière saw returning from a hunting trip with Sultan Murad II himself. They were probably part of the Solak, right? And while the other 50 horsemen that are mentioned here on the occasion were part of the Mutaferrika, so the Christian vassal princes. So it's interesting because these troops are together with the Sultan all the time, and there is this interesting parallel between cavalry and infantry, right, combined. Then there were, according always to La Baroquière, 20 or 30 baston, or baston if you prefer, armed slaves, that the source reports elsewhere as gate guardians, right? And these were possible the Paiks, right? even though they could also belong to other units that we will deal with another time. And however, the important thing is that these guys were armed with axes or maces, which also are very important weapon, especially for attacking other elite, especially heavily armored troops, right? Because these are blunt weapons, and that's what you do with them. So there is it's as if these picked units that were the actual bodyguard of the Sultan, tactically speaking, I mean, they were at least the closest to him all the time, had this full combination of basically every type of weapon, right? We have seen the archers, we've seen the cavalrymen, we've seen this kind of shock troops, and so it's very functional. The other part instead gives the Solak at a strength of 80. Then there are other interesting sources, for example Mihailovich, which provides one of the most comprehensive informations on the composition of the Qapu Khalqi, right, and how it was organized in this period, which is even more consistent of the most famous Ordo Porte. And this description breakdown of the Qapu Khalqi is probably dated to the late Mehmet II's reign, right? And albeit the numbers that are provided here are not completely consistent, let's say congruent with the ones we have listed before. Mihailovich describes the household cavalry as comprising Gureba, that were specifically 600 Tartars and presumably Crimean Tartars, that were composed by 2 bullocks of 300 men each. The Ulufecyian were 600 as well. The Salaried 300 men, right? So essentially half of what the Ordo Porte states. And the task of the Salarieds in here was to lead a horse before the Sultan when necessary. Then eventually there were the Sipahi-oghlan that were also 300 strong. And the last that Mihailovich describes as the highest of the household regiments, like so the Sipahi-oghlan at least are congruent in this sense. The other source, they have the task of carrying swords after the Sultan, also having girded themselves with bows and arrows whenever necessary. It will fall to one of them to bear a sword once every year or two. All of them are mounted. So the Solak is described instead as with this task of walking before the Sultan with bows, and according to Mihailovich, it's they were 60 strong. In addition, there was this other regiment of the Capizzi that was Capizzi, actually, or Capici, I don't know how it's pronounced. It comprised of 200 gate guardians under 2 Capizzi Bashis. The Ordo Porte mentions also among let's say these units among the Janisseries specifically, putting their strength at 80 men and paid from 6 to 8 aspers a day. And we know from other sources that they performed the function of messengers as well as gatekeepers. And it seems in part that they were the same thing of the pegs that we have mentioned above. then Mihailovich reports that of the household regiments in general, including the Janisseries, they had their task in common, which was at night to lie near the Sultan and to take the night watch silently. Whether there is rain or snow, winter or blizzard, or whatever sort of weather, each must remain in his place. Each night 50, and when necessary sometimes 100. And none of need concern himself about any weapon. The Sultan provides whatever befits each of them according to his rank, whether cavalryman or foot soldier, armor for horses, and assorted weapons according to their custom. In addition, Mihailovich lists further elements of the Qapu Khalqi that have not been mentioned before. The other sources, that is the Casni-Gir, or so-called tasters, comprised by 80 men, the Xi-oghlan, that were basically chamberlains, 50 men, the Mirahor or grooms, 800 men, responsible for the 2,000 horses which the Sultan distributed, quote, as necessary with saddles and accoutrements, especially when there is a great battle. The Tsebetsi, or armorers, that were 60 men, a unit founded by Mehmed II that was responsible not only for making the armor weapons used by the Qapu Khalqi, but also charged with their transport as well, even serving in the field as hand gunners. Now this is very interesting because, okay, let's complete the list. And there were the Meteri, or tent pitchers, 60 men, that are similar by name to another unit that is the Meteran Itabul Alem, which is the military band, which is another thing we will discuss on another occasion. And lastly, the cooks, camel keepers, and musicians, numbering 200 men in all, right? And finally, there was yet another body which that he doesn't mention within his chapter on the port, but he refers to in another place. There was the Kavuzlar, right? And these were courtiers on armored horses who in battle performed the duties of sergeant at arms, being set out by the Sultan to observe who is doing any brave deed and how the battle is going, right? And each of them holds a mace in his hand, urging the troops into battle. And wherever they are, it is as if the Sultan himself were there, and everybody fears them, for whoever they praise in front of the Sultan will get advancement, but woe betide anyone they criticize. Their leader is called the Kavus Bashi. And the Pseudos Francis refers to this unit of Kavuslar, that point, in the final assault of Constantinople, where he describes that the Turks were falling back, and the Sultan's military police and court officials beat them back with iron maces and whips. So this is very interesting. The Ordo Parte actually puts the strength of this unit at 80 men. So you understand that in Mihailovich's account, this thing is, really much more, in part much more realistic, while the other sources are more concerned about the general size of the units. Here, Mihailovich lists also the kind of smaller parts of them, of this corps, and how they function and what for, right? So many of these names, as you understand, are they reflect the courtly names and functions that, however, at this point were names of military units that carried out, strictly speaking, military duties. But this had to do literally with everything, like how the same logistics of the Qapu Khalqi and how it worked comprehensively, right? That were the chamberlains, as we've seen. There were the tasters, right? We don't know what they did, but but this, for example, the Mirahor or grooms, that these were 200 men responsible for the 2,000 horses which the Sultan himself distributed in case of great battle, right? Always remember in this context also the kind of the older distribution and promotion system that entails still this clienterly society of the Sultan rewarding who was doing well or not. Those who carry presumably were the Tsabetsi, known as the armors, or the Materias, the tent pitchers, right? And probably they had this kind of actual roles of maintaining the weapons and or the camp respectively, and the cooks, and of course, and the camel keepers and the musicians as well, right? What is interesting also is this last unit of the Kalvuzlar that are the eyes and ears of the Sultan during the battle, and that have this function of actually also spurring the troops and even pushing them back when they were fleeing. Naturally, there is a limit to this in functionality. You can't stop a mass rout, but still having these what here it's interesting is that they are conceived as if they were the Sultan themselves who was judging them, and at that point they wanted to be reported as having been brave and therefore being promoted by the Sultan himself, or otherwise they also fear their punishment, of course. So this is more than an actual organical explanation of the composition of the Qapu Khalqi. At least, however, the acknowledgement of what functions in general, what tactical needs specifically, were required to this unit and how it could function internally, like of a Ottoman army of the 15th century. So there were further units as well. By the way, what did I read here? Whatever. There were other elements, again, that are not listed by Mihailovich, but still part of the Qapu Khalqi. And these were the Topku Okaki, that is Okak of the gunners, and the Top Arabati. I don't know whether it's Okak or Otsak. I have literally no idea, so excuse me for that, but I didn't check it. And the Top Arabati instead were the gun carriage drivers. These two units are very important because, as you know, the Ottomans were pretty advanced on artillery, especially towards the end of the 15th century. They had fully developed this mindset. Other Muslim powers actually didn't have, or at least especially in the Pontic and Persian area, there was still this traditionalist view of what horse archery and mounted warfare in general had to be, and artillery being perceived as a sort of there being a lot of prejudices towards it, and even discrimination of the units that manned them. Also, the Ottomans probably at the beginning had similar resistances, but they eventually were the only power now that had enough power to develop an artillery park that other powers around objectively didn't have. Right, the Ottomans were on the lead in firearms in this time. And we will discuss actually Ottoman artillery on another occasion. And we have to add to these troops also other two units, the Umbaratzian, that is the mortar men, and the Lajimitsian, that are the sappers. So this 4 units overall are all about siege warfare, fundamentally, and that was so crucial in this time of expansion of the Ottoman Empire, especially. And the latter 2 units were both established by Murad II and were organized identically, right? They were in turn subdivided each into 2 units, one of which received a regular salary and was attached to the Tibet and was thus part of the port proper, while the other was scattered throughout the provinces and supported by Timars, right? And that were the regional, the provinces fundamentally of the empire, and effectively coming under the command of the provincial governors. In addition, the Qapu Khalqi element of the mortarmen was further subdivided, with those who actually operated guns on campaign being attached to the Qapu Khalqi. And each of these various companies was organized into ortas that were units of 50 men. So this naturally is an appendix that we will maybe expand on next time, but here you realize the whole picture, albeit a bit complicated, but it's actually simple in its ensemble, is the one of an army on its own. And that's fundamentally what at the thresholds of the modern age you want to build, and that the Ottomans could do while many other powers at this point couldn't. Even in Europe, like normal monarchies were struggling to create, especially in Central Europe, a central coordinate, like a centralized state that could support a permanent army, right? The Ottomans naturally had enormous amount of resources, could afford something like this, and this doesn't mean that this was the actual Ottoman army. There were all the irregulars, think of the Adzabs, the Akinsis, and others, etc., that constituted the largest amount of the Ottoman forces numerically, and also actual foreigners that often participated as vassals to the Ottoman campaigns, right? But the importance of a core, professional, permanent, standing unit that was present together with the Sultan in every campaign was of dramatic importance. Here we have, for example, listed the last units, one of which was maintained actually in Constantinople proper, the other was actually maintained by the other provinces, right? And this also speaks for the necessity of having a specialized unit of military engineers that could be deployed wherever it was needed, and that could afford the actual material and the skills, because that's a concrete problem, right? If you want to, as we were saying before, the various local, think of the same Timars, locally they didn't have much of a military organization on their own. They fundamentally recruited the local militias and whoever joined them, and they had these commissions, and that's how they fielded them. But that's a very different thing, for example, in technological terms, when you need to have this concentration of military engineering and engineers and other specialists that you can't find like behind the corner in every single place of the empire, and also the need actual money and resources for maintaining their equipment, and there was naturally at this point at the beginning of the modern age also a necessity of improving further, like of investing in technology that naturally was largely expanding by itself, but naturally at the same time it required funding. It required someone who paid for it, and here the port would do, and the granulation of the powder, for example, was the greatest invention in firearms, up to the bayonet, right, as a general change in modern warfare, and this was an Ottoman invention. So these were things that is important to centralize in terms of research and in funds that can sustain it, right? So this explains also the great logistical capabilities of the Ottomans during this period, that especially after the conquest of Constantinople were now a real regional power with a very sound base to expand from, and that in fact came to overwhelm some of the major powers around there. Think about Mamluk Egypt or Hungary, and this is in part fruit also of this capability of centralization and having the best concentrated constantly in the major campaigns. Although always bear in mind that this is not all what makes the difference, right? It can make a substantial difference in relative terms, but still warfare is a much broader and more complicated business that not even this preeminence can can substitute practically. All right, I think for today we can stop it here. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.